I'm Ray Fawkes, creator of In the Flood, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swenimer. If you want to drop me a line, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Ray Fawkes about In the Flood. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. It's also available on the True North Country Comics channel on YouTube. I invite you to like and subscribe. Ray is the critically acclaimed author of the comics and graphic novels Underwinter, Intersect, One Soul, The People Inside, The Spectral Engine, Possessions, and Junction True, as well as Batman Eternal, Constantine, Justice League Dark, and Gotham by Midnight for DC, Wolverines for Marvel, Black Hammer 45 for Dark Horse, Jackpot for Aftershock, and many more. He's an Eisner, Harvey, and Schuster Award nominee and a YALSA Award winner. Ray has been making comics for over 20 years, starting and continuing the tradition of do-it-yourself fiction, as well as working for many major comics publishers in the US and Canada. Although published originally by Comixology, In the Flood is his latest work published by Dark Horse Comics. In the Flood is described as follows. Trapped and separated by an apocalyptic rainfall, Mike and Clara, devoted husband and wife, have sworn to find their way back to one another. But they quickly discover that the rain, and their predicament, is not what it seems. Can they figure out the grand trick that's being played on them and overcome it to reunite? And so, without further ado, here's my chat with Ray Fawkes about In the Flood. So, Ray Fawkes, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
It's a pleasure.
I appreciate your time. What I usually do to start off the interview is ask the creator about their first comic book. So I'm wondering if you remember, what was the first comic book that you read?
Yeah, you know what? I think the first comic book I read for myself was one of those little, I don't know if you remember, but a long time ago, Marvel used to reprint a bunch of their comics in little digests that had a flip book in the corner. So I think it was a Spider-Man comic, but I have a distinct memory. It was probably when I was just learning to read, because I remember like constantly flipping the pages and there would be a little tiny animation of Spider-Man in the corner. And I think that's the first comic book I remember reading by myself.
Cool. I vaguely recall that.
Yeah, it would have been a reprint of like early 70s Spider-Man or something like that.
Good stuff. Well, that's definitely great when you're growing up, but I'm wondering who or what inspires you to create today?
Oh, that's a big question. I'm kind of one of those people that when I get to the comic shop, I just kind of dig through looking for anything new or unusual. I mean, obviously I'm very inspired by some of my contemporaries and friends in the business, like Jeff Lemire and Matt Kint, Nate Powell, these guys who are doing amazing work that can be big and bombastic or still feel, very DIY. And that's kind of how I see my own work. So I'm inspired by them all the time. And then, it really depends on what I'm looking at. If I want something super creepy, I go to guys like Junji Ito. He always inspires me. I like going to that. My favorite comic book store is a store in Toronto called the Big Island, and they're one of the only stores that I know of that still has a consignment shelf.
Oh, okay.
You get in there and you can see people's like super bizarre photocopied $1 comics still, and I love digging through that stuff.
That's cool. Well, we're here talking about your latest project, In the Flood. Now, I know that it was released already digitally, but now the first time it's being available in physical copy from Dark Horse Comics. So I wonder if you could talk a wee bit about the story and maybe what inspired you to create it as well.
Sure. In the Flood is a story about a man and his wife. The man's name is Mike and his wife's name is Clara, and they're very devoted to each other, and they are separated by a storm. Mike is forced to stay in the house that they share, and Clara is out somewhere. And Mike has promised to stay at home waiting for Clara to come back to him so that she'll know where he is. They won't lose each other. And, as the story progresses, it quickly becomes apparent that the storm is not normal, and something very unusual is happening to Mike and Clara, and getting back together is not going to be as easy as just finding her way home.
Yeah, it's definitely a haunting book, I would say. The way it's presented and told. I mean, the way you described it sounded like it could be like a half-hour dramatic, soap opera. But it's more than that. The way you presented it and the colors and the non-linear fashion of it, I think, was quite unique.
I mean, it's quite an experimental book. My inspirations at the time that I was creating it, I mean, some of my biggest inspirations are film, and I always look to people like David Lynch or giallo movies of the 70s. So I'm always thinking of how something can be told in a non-linear fashion, perhaps, or in a fashion that makes it something more like a puzzle box than a story sometimes,
Sure, absolutely. Now, as I mentioned before, it was originally released digitally, but now offered in trade paperback. How does it feel? Like, what's your reaction when you get to hold it in your hand as a physical copy? What's that like?
Well, I mean, I'm a little bit of an old man about this stuff, so I love that I can hold a copy of the book in my hands. It was interesting for me to create a book for the digital. It was originally created for Comixology's digital Comixology First program, and I loved doing it. And I was very impressed with how it was presented. I'm just the kind of person that I don't reach for my laptop or my iPad when I want to read a book. I like to have it on my shelf. So I'm very, very pleased that Dark Horse put out a physical copy of it.
I know that sometimes when you're working on a project and it comes back from the printer and it comes to the envelope and you get it, you open up, you say, okay, now it's complete. Did you feel that this book wasn't really complete in quotation marks until you held this Dark Horse copy?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, I had the pleasure of, seeing when it released digitally and reading in that form. I am kind of a person, I am one of those creators who creates a book, puts it out there, and then rarely looks at it again. Like, for me, the feeling of completion is kind of the day that I say, yeah, it's done, and I hand it over. It's nice to have the books on my shelf. It's nice to be able to point to them. By that point, it's almost become something divorced from me.
Right. Until someone brings it to you to a table at a festival or convention and says, please sign this, please.
Yes, and then it transforms into something completely other, because it's something that's then shared between me and a reader.
Right. Very good. Well, I wanted to ask you about your collaborators. Lee Lowbridge is the colorist and Thomas Maurer is the letterer. Can you talk a wee bit about the collaboration process? Because they were very instrumental in having your vision come to life.
Oh, I mean, they were fantastic. Lee was the first one I really discussed what I wanted to have happening in the story with, and he was very enthusiastic, and he presented me with such simple and beautiful solutions as far as, when you have something that's kind of like nonlinear or multi-layered or multi-dimensional, it can be difficult to make sure that the readers are not lost. And so Lee, more than anything else, he was instrumental in making sure that people had a clear awareness of where they were in the story. And so his ideas were very appreciated. I loved it. And then Thomas brought this really cool style to the book that was something I hadn't really considered. I honestly, if I'd lettered it myself, I think it wouldn't have been quite as lively as Thomas made it. So that was great. And actually, Thomas did some of the design work on the interstitial pages, titles and everything. And I really appreciate what he did.
Yeah, it's almost like without that, I wouldn't say it'd be lesser, but it certainly gives a voice that literally jumps off the page.
Yeah, I would say it would be lesser. These two really brought something to the table. It was not like a production where I was just directing them and they were just doing what they were told. They were throwing in ideas that were really, really appreciated.
Yeah, for sure. Now, as we mentioned before, it's not a linear story in the way that most graphic novels are presented, but I wonder if you could talk a wee bit about how you use this medium of the comic book to convey that nonlinear narrative? There's certainly a beginning and an end, but people can't go back and forth, right? Was that part of the effort when you're using?
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, so one of the things I really love about comic books, there's a few things that are unique to the medium, and one of them is the relationship the pages have to each other. I know that, if you want to, you could scrub back and forth in a movie, or you could turn back and forth in a book. But in a comic book, if you turn back and forth, you're actually like, the pages can be mapped onto each other or on top of each other, and the panel positions become important and things like that. So when you're moving through a comic, when your eye is moving across the page or whatever, you're moving in time and space, and the turning of the pages can be part of that manipulation too. And I love to play with that in a number of my books. I like to play with the shape of what's on each page, and then the shape of what's on the pages related to each other, and how that relates to time, and how in a book like this, some pieces of time can be scrambled and mixed in with other ones, and they will bring a sort of an echo across to each other. It becomes like a musical rhythm, or like a poetic rhythm.
Very good. And that leads me to my next question. During the COVID, I asked a lot of creators to come up with their top 10 list. And I asked Scott Chandler to recommend his top 10, and he recommended your book, One Soul.
Yes.
In fact, he recommends it to everyone who will listen, and he wishes that it was better known. So looking back at this, almost 10 years ago, this Eisner-nominated book, One Soul, came out. Can you explain why it resonates so well with readers? Because it's a very complex book.
I'm so pleased that One Soul appeared to achieve what I hoped it achieved, because One Soul was supposed to be about the universality of human experience. And the book itself was one of my biggest experiments with the time and space on the page, because One Soul is, for those who've never seen it, it's a series of 18 panel grids, like double page spread, so 9 panels per page, that actually tells 18 simultaneous stories of the entire life from birth to death of 18 different people around the world and throughout history. And the experience of the book is meant to be that you can individually follow one life if you want to just page through the book and keep looking at the same position on the grid, or you can sort of zoom back and experience all 18 lives at the same time, and you can see their differences and their commonalities and what they see of the world and what you see when you see all of them together.
Yeah, very innovative, that's for sure. For sure. I want to switch gears a wee bit and talk about the tools used to create your art. I know you're a writer and an artist, but I wonder if you could focus a wee bit on your artistic skills when you're creating. What tools do you use?
Sure. I mean, it's funny actually to talk about this within the Flood, because I'm a bit of a traditionalist. Like, I like to get my fingers into stuff, and I'm very tactile. And so like I use paints and inks and brayers and stamps and old wrecked brushes and beautiful new brushes and whatever. In the Flood actually was the first book that I drew entirely digitally.
Really? Oh.
Yeah, and it was the result of a lot of experimentation on my part to see if I could make a book feel as tactile to me doing the artwork. So I actually spent a lot of time finding or duplicating the tools that I use in real life, like ink rollers and nibs and liquid paper and stuff like that. And I think it was a success. It feels like Absolutely. It was a success to me.
Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed that, to tell you the truth. So was the success of that, did it prompt you to say, okay, I'm going to go all digital now, or are you going to do a mixture of the two moving forward?
I would say it prompted me to be like less of a grump about digital stuff.
Okay.
I'm happy to sort of mix it in with what I'm doing now, but it's not like at any point I had like a eureka moment and said, well, I'm all digital from now on. I still do a lot of traditional work, but it did make me say, as I start a piece or as I'm working on a piece, now instead of just like approaching it and saying, how do I attack this? I say, how do I attack this? And digital is part of my toolbox.
Mm-hmm. Right. Ah, very good. Very good. I know that we've been talking a wee bit about In the Flood, and I know that came out last year, but do you have any other upcoming projects you can talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I have another personal project that I'm working on. I don't, there's no release date set for it yet, so I'm not sure how much to say about it, but it's a book about poltergeists.
Oh, okay.
I am currently, I know it's been announced on his Substack. I am painting the pages for a new Colonel Weird story for Jeff.
Oh, nice.
And those are being fully painted. And actually, I think they're going to start showing up on his Substack this month.
Okay. Yeah, that's something new. I know that Jeff has been part of it, and I think Chip Zdarsky is part of Substack. Is it something that I know you've been hugely successful working with the major publishers.
Yeah.
Do you think Substack and the platforms like that would be helpful in the future for you to publish your work?
For me, any publisher that, new or old, who steps up to creators and says, we would like to back you doing, what you want to do. We would like to back you in your absolute creative madness is good, in my opinion. Whether it's digital or traditional, whether it's, like a big company or it's like a new venture capital backed thing like Substack, I think it's good as long as voices are, reaching the audience.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So I'm not very picky. I mean, obviously, in my personal experience, there are publishers that I like working with more or less, and that can be for reasons of business or reasons of personal connections. But, philosophically speaking, anyone who's willing to step up and say, let's get a bunch of creators together and get them to make some books, I'm happy about it.
Great. Good. I know that we last met up at C2E2 way back in 2019, which seems like ages ago. But I'm curious to know if you have any plans to attend any future conventions or festivals this year.
I've just been starting to look at doing that.
Okay.
And so I think probably in the latter half of the year I will. Maybe New York, maybe a couple of shows in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in Toronto, so I always like to do shows here.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even think about it until probably a week or two ago, so I'm a little late for a lot of the first half of the year. But definitely in the second half of the year, I'm going to start doing shows again.
Great. Good stuff. Maybe we'll get out there and see you. That's for sure.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So with all the work that you've got going on and will happen in the future, I'm wondering if there's a website or social media where you recommend people go to find out about your ongoing projects.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a site, just, rayfawkes.com, which I need to update, but yeah. And then people can find me on Instagram. I'm fox.ray.
Thanks to Ray for the chat. You can discover more about Ray on Twitter at Ray Fawkes, on Instagram at Fox.Ray, and online at rayfawkes.com. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to it and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please leave a good rating. Also check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at True North Comics. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. And please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening. Come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2022.